Hello and welcome to this Museum at Home webinar live from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Amanda Dennett, Head of Digital Experience. With me today is Dr. Karl James, Head of Military History. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Today we'll look at Australia's involvement in the war, VP Day celebrations and the war's end. I'll be asking Karl some questions about what was happening 75 years ago and the role Australia played in the conflict. Then it will be your turn to ask the questions. This is an interactive webinar where you can send through your questions using the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Karl James has been a historian at the Memorial since 2006 and the Head of Military History since 2019. A graduate of the University of Wollongong, his research focuses on Australia's involvement in the Second World War. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So we will kick off now with our questions. Karl, can you set the scene for us? What was happening 75 years ago?
So if we cast our minds back to 1945, for Australia, we had been at war for 6 years. Australian forces had fought through the Middle East and the Mediterranean, so we had held Tobruk, fought in mainland Greece and Crete, fought in at El Alamein. Australian forces have been, Australian airmen have been very active in the war against Europe. The Royal Australian Navy was contributing all around the world in many different areas. You know, our forces had fought through Kokoda, Milne Bay, New Guinea, and by 1945, Australia was militarily more heavily committed than at any other time during the war. In fact, our forces were actually fighting 7 separate campaigns, with troops deployed to New Guinea, Bougainville, Rabaul. In mid-1945, we just committed the 3 major amphibious operations at Balikpapan, at Tarakan, Labuan and Balikpapan and Borneo. And we had an ongoing commitment to and a contribution to the liberation of the Philippines. So we're really there at the sharp end from a military point of view. Again, to 1945, the Axis had been on the back foot. So in May, Germany surrenders, and the Japanese and the Japanese Empire was still fighting on, but they too had suffered a series of setbacks and defeats, with the Japanese forces having lost the Philippines, ongoing fighting in Burma and in China. The American US Navy and Marines had landed at places such as Iwo, now Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands too were being subjected to regular bombing from American B-29 superfortresses. And this is when we've seen those horrific and terrifying images of the firebombing of Tokyo, for example. So the war was very much, the Allies were in ascendance, we were still winning. But it looked as though, for many intents and purposes, the war against Japan will possibly continue at least into 1946. And certainly that's what a lot of senior military planners and politicians were planning and figuring on. And then all of a sudden, everything kind of changed with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on the 6th of August, then Nagasaki on the 9th. And on the 9th too, the Soviet Union declared war against Japan and invaded Manchuria. So very quickly, the war went from, in mid-1945, from looking as though the war against Japan would continue into 1946 to early and then mid-August to almost being over very quickly.
And how did Australians learn that the war was over? Was it a surprise?
Very much so, because the development of the Manhattan Project, so the American, or the British and then the American activities to develop the atomic bomb, was surrounded in intense secrecy. So certainly Australian military leaders and planners, we didn't know about the bomb. Most soldiers didn't either. So it certainly came as news and as surprise. And then after Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war, I mean, there's a range of different reasons why Japan was defeated. But after the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war, this is the point when Emperor Hirohito said, no, Japan needed to surrender. And from about the 11th and the 10th of August, there's a lot of diplomatic channels and correspondence going back between Japan and the Allied powers. First of all, acknowledging that Japan were looking to surrender, some negotiations around the role and status of the emperor, and these diplomatic correspondence was being reported in the press. So if you look at Trove, for example, the amazing newspaper collection from the National Library of Australia, you can read newspaper reports from about the 10th, 11th of August, people are predicting an end to the war. And then late on the 14th of August, there is the news that Japan will accept the surrender, they'll accept the Allies' terms and will surrender. And then on the 15th of August, the news is made public. So around about 9:30 a.m, the 15th of August was a Wednesday. So around about in the morning, 9:30, around about 9:30 a.m, people gathered around their wireless sets and they listened to the broadcast by Prime Minister Ben Chifley.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia, Mr. J.B. Chifley.
Fellow citizens, the war is over. The Japanese government has accepted the terms of surrender imposed by the Allied nations, and hostilities will now cease. The reply by the Japanese government to the note sent by Britain, the United Nations, the USSR and China has been received and accepted by the Allied nations. At this moment, let us offer thanks to God. Let us remember those whose lives were given that we may enjoy this glorious moment and may look forward to a peace which they have won for us. Let us remember those whose thoughts, with proud sorrow, turn towards gallant loved ones who will not come back. On behalf of the people and the Government of Australia, I offer humble thanks to the fighting men of the United Nations, whose gallantry, sacrifice and devotion to duty have brought us the victory. Nothing can fully repay the debt we owe them, nor can history record in adequate terms their deeds from the black days that followed September 1939 and December 1941 until this moment. We owe, too, a great debt to those men and women who performed miracles of production in secondary and primary industries so that the battle of supply could be won and a massive effort achieved. Materials, money and resources have been poured out so that the fighting men would not go short. Australia's part comparatively, in terms of fighting forces and supplies, ranks high, and the Australian people may be justly proud of everything they have done. In the name of the Commonwealth Government, I invite you to join in the Thanksgiving services arranged, for truly this is a time to give thanks to God and to those men against whose sacrifices for us there is no comparison. Good day to you, fellow citizens.
So we're all familiar with some of the iconic images of VP Day celebrations. Karl, what was the reaction to the end of the war?
Well, as you can imagine, and as we've seen in some of those great newsreel footage and photographs, scenes of pretty much just wild celebration spontaneously broke out in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and towns and cities across the nation, because this was a massive relief. It was a huge celebration. Not only had we just come through this terribly devastating conflict, not only had Australians endured from a military point of view, more heavily committed than any other time during the war, so it was a huge relief. But it's really interesting and keep in mind too, there's a day of mixed emotions. So the ceremonies themselves took place in a variety of different ways. In the centre of Sydney, for example, it was estimated that 1 million people packed the centre of the CBD, and they gathered around Martin Place in the Domain. There was a march of soldiers and personnel, so military personnel, some veterans. There was flypast of aircraft. Other parts of the country too, you would see sporting activities took place to celebrate, concerts, and there's also quite a large number of Thanksgiving services and religious services too. So, and that is already that first hint that of celebration, but also relief, but also as a day of mixed emotions too, because so many people had lost loved ones during the war. And this is when you first get that sense of, oh, it's not just a party, there is a tinge of sadness and sometimes a bit of grief as well, because a lot of people saw their loved ones coming back from the war or knew they would be coming back. Well, to see other people's loved ones coming back, but they themselves knew that their husband, their father, their sister may not be returning. So it's really a day of mixed emotions. And the other thing which makes the day quite interesting too is once you start to look at the war diaries, the letters from the soldiers themselves, and even sometimes their own reminiscences, the further away from the fighting, the more joyous the celebration. So in Sydney, boom, 1 million people can celebrate. If you contrast that to soldiers in the front line of Bougainville, for example, so Peter Metcalf, he was a 19-year-old lieutenant or 19-year-old lance corporal, and he wrote that strangely no one laughed or cheered. All afternoon we sat quietly and speculated. We found it hard to fully understand. So put yourself in their mindset. You're a 19-year-old rifleman, you've grown up with the war always in the background, you're in the front line in southern Bougainville, you're sitting there in the banks of the Mivo River. On the opposite side of the river, there's the Japanese. You know the Japanese are there. Only a few hours ago, you're taking pot shots at each other. So you go from a very hot war to, well, now the war is over, we're supposed to stop fighting. We know, which the Japanese know. And certainly too, across the Pacific, you still have active squadrons from the Royal Australian Air Force still carrying out operations and strikes against the Japanese. You have ships with the British Pacific Fleet. They're still shelling and bombarding parts of Japan right up to the 15th of August. So it would be an incredibly hard mindset to go from, we're now fighting this enemy, to it's all over. So it's a real day of mixed trepidation. And I remember too talking to a veteran from Bougainville, and his memory of the 15th of August of VP Day was that all of a sudden, it's like flicking a trigger, he said, all of his mates suddenly became very cautious because they don't, having come through this terrible conflict, having fought for 2 or 3 years in New Guinea and then Bougainville, you don't want to be the person who's killed right at the very end. You don't want to come through this conflict only to get knocked through an accident or a booby trap. So it was really a day of mixed emotions. Celebration, but also, well, what next? As well as a day to reflect on their mates who'd either been wounded, killed, or missing.
So let's look now at Australia's involvement and contribution to the war. Can you talk to us about the scope and scale of Australia's military commitment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the reason why VP Day was celebrated so much, because of Australia's massive commitment to the conflict. So we had been at war for 6 years. Nearly 1 million men and women wore a uniform. So that was 1 in 7 Australians wore a military uniform during the conflict. 500,000 Australians serve overseas, and we suffered some 40,000 Australian personnel who died during the conflict. So from a military point of view, it's a huge commitment. In terms of our forces, Australian troops, squadrons, units and ships are really just deployed all across the world, from the Mediterranean and North Africa through to the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific. And the interesting thing is that once you look into the records a little bit and search through sometimes the secondary literature, if you look hard enough, you can pretty much find an Australian or an Australian unit anywhere, particularly if they're serving with the Royal Air Force or the Royal Australian Navy. So it was a huge military contribution to the war.
So Australia's casualties included some 30,000 prisoners of war. Can you tell us briefly about some of those experiences?
Well, that's a really key thing to remember, because while we tend to focus on, say, the military campaigns, say Tobruk, Alamein, Kokoda, Milne Bay, for example, we've also got the Fighting 8th Division who were captured at Singapore, and we can't really reflect on Australia's involvement in the Second World War without addressing or remembering, commemorating our prisoners of war. Some 22,000 Australians became prisoners of war. 8,500 were captured by the Germans and the Italians, and so they captured at Tobruk, or in the retreat from Benghazi, for example, shot down over occupied Europe. So you have 8,500 prisoners of the Germans and the Italians. But the largest group were the 22,000 Australians who were captured by the Japanese in those early dark months of 1944. In early 1942, with the fall of Singapore, Timor, Java and Rabaul. And the thing to keep in mind for many of the Australian families back home, apart from receiving a telegram or the official notification that their loved one was captured by the Japanese and believed missing, for most of those families back home, their father, their brother, their husband, their sister has basically disappeared off the face of the earth for 3.5 years. Unlike the prisoners of the Germans and the Italians, who did follow the communications through the International Red Cross, for example, most Australian prisoners who suffered of the Japanese, whether it be at Singapore, Changi, Sandakan, and anywhere else across Southeast Asia, they had virtually no contact with their families at home. And for the families at home, this sense of apprehension and uncertainty was always in the back of their minds, because they just didn't know what was happening to them. And in many ways, one of the reasons why Australian forces and Australian leaders wanted for us to maintain a very active role in the war and to pursue to defeat Japan was the motivation for the repatriation of our Australian prisoners. It was a really powerful factor in trying for us to maintain an active military effort, and you'll see in the archives, for example, a lot of family members writing to the local parliamentarians, writing to politicians, writing to Curtin and their chiefly saying, what about our prisoners of the Japanese? What about our sons who were captured in Singapore? So it's a really big part of the story. And then once you drill into it too, because the Japanese essentially used Allied prisoners of war as a disposable labour force. Our prisoners of war of the Japanese were sent all across the Japanese Empire, whether they be sent to Borneo, sent Dakin to develop an airstrip, working the Thai-Burma Railway, sent to work in docks in Indochina, or even working in the coal mines of Japan. The POW experience is really quite diverse. There's no single narrative. But it's a big part of our story, and you can't think about Australia's involvement in the Second World War without addressing the suffering and just the loss too of our prisoners of war.
So, did Australia's commitments and experiences in the war shape Australia's relationship and even its dependence with the Allies?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think a lot of people think, or it's often presumed and presented, that leading up to the Second World War, Australia was very much still part of the British Empire and buddy-buddy with Britain, but then you have the South Pacific War, and then all of a sudden we dump Britain for the United States. But in many ways that's a little bit of a myth. What we do see though is, if you're looking at it from a political and from a military strategic point of view, that Australia becomes increasingly more assertive and more confident within its relationship with Britain. And then in 1942 and onwards, it has a different relationship with the United States. So if we cast our minds back as to why did we actually go to war, the declaration of war. So yes, Britain controlled basically a lot of external influences. So when a state of war existed, when Britain declared war, then therefore automatically Australia was also at war. But key, what is important, is that we could determine to a certain point what level of commitment. So in 1939, for example, there isn't the same rush of colours, there isn't the naivety of what we saw in 1914. We're not pledging to support Britain to the last man, to the last shilling. Instead, this is a case of, well, we're going to see what works for us in our region, what are our interests. And increasingly particularly during 1941, the Australian government becomes much more assertive in pushing and lobbying Britain to look after Australia's interests. So we saw this after the debacle in the Greece Creek campaign, mainly as a consequence of that, because Australian forces had been committed to Greece and Crete without really government's approval. Disastrous defeat. Large number of prisoners from prisoners from the 6th Division become prisoners of the Germans. So you've got the debacle of Greece and Crete, and then later on during the course of the year 2, you have the Australian government's really pushing for the relief of the Australian forces in Tobruk. So during 1941, we become a little bit more pushy and a little bit more assertive with Britain. You have the attack on Pearl Harbor, the start of the Pacific War, and then from December 1941, Prime Minister John Curtin makes his very famous call or pledge to the United States, essentially saying, without any pains of the past, we're looking to the US for a new alliance and a new relationship. That's sometimes taken as a key that Australia is now pivoted from Britain to the US. But really what you'll see during the course of 1942 is, while the Australian-American relationship works very well, particularly that interpersonal relationship with Curtin and General Douglas MacArthur, over time it really wanes. And by 1944, and certainly by 1945, Australia is still very much in that British imperial camp, or the British Commonwealth camp. We have a large commitment to Britain through the air war, but also there's motivations too to bring out a British formation to fight in the South Pacific, to be based in Australia, and you have the British Pacific Fleet. So there's still this big pivot, or a return I should say, back to Britain. And then at the end of the war, you find Australia's much more assertive, more confident, and you have people such as Doc Emmett, for example, who's really championing Australia to be a little bit more independent, a little bit more assertive. And then we take a leading voice in what would become the United Nations. So we emerge from the conflict with a different, much more sophisticated relationship with Britain. We've engaged with the new great and powerful ally in the United States, but Australia's very much, we're going to pursue our own way for our own interests.
So the Second World War brought about significant social change in Australia. Can you talk to us a bit about how women contributed to Australia's war effort?
Well, that's a huge part of the story, and it's another reason why I feel the Second World War is so important to Australian history. So during the course of the conflict, we saw some 66,000 women volunteer into the forces. And they served as firstly nurses, but then the auxiliary services for the Royal Australian Air Force, the Royal Australian Navy, and the Australian Army. And you have a range of women taking on a whole range of different roles. So they're moving beyond the traditional role, away from just nursing, but from nursing and clerical work, but they're also working, in fact, from the military point of view, they're servicing aircraft, taking on new technical skills, they're manning searchlight batteries or operating searchlight batteries rather than manning searchlight batteries, anti-aircraft guns, a whole range of different things from a military point of view. And it's really the Royal Australian Air Force who take the lead because they recognise the skill set and the potential value in having a large female staffing point of view. And the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force, the WAF, they're the largest female service with some 27,000 women enrolling in the forces. There's a big military point of view, a very heavy military commitment.
And can you also talk to us, in that context of social change, about the role that and the contribution of Indigenous Australians to the Second World War?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, in addition to being a key change from a women's point of view and women's services point of view, and I should also mention too the Australian Women's Land Army. The Land Army girls did a massive contribution during the war, and they were largely, or many, younger women who tended to be in city areas who joined the Women's Land Army, and they worked in farms, canneries and stuff across the country. It was an attempt to improve, or relieve the male labour force and to send new people into the country. And so once you include the military services as well as the Women's Land Army, you're looking at some 70,000 women who were actively mobilised in the war. So it's a really big part of our story. Unfortunately, though, the downside is that in many instances, while they're doing and working alongside their male counterparts, they actually paid less than their male colleagues, which was naturally a source of sore point. So you've got an element of independence, moving away from home, some freedom outside the normal family unit, but they're not getting paid as much as their male colleagues. Which is an interesting segue to the mobilisation of Australia's Indigenous population during the war, because we know that researchers here at the Australian War Memorial have identified some 5,000 individual Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders and South Seas Islanders who've served in the forces. And it's a really interesting point of comparison, because even though you do have the Defence Act of 1909 that explicitly excluded people of non-significant, non-substantial European origin enlisting in the forces, you still have quite a large number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders volunteering and being mobilised. And their experiences too were really different if you say compare them to the United States. So in the United States military, you had a segregated, or the US Army and the US Navy was segregated between white and African American soldiers and units. Whereas from the Australian point of view, you had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders largely enlisting in the forces alongside their, just as part of the conventional soldiers, for example. So Reg Saunders, who was our first known Aboriginal officer, or our first known officer, our first identified Aboriginal man to be commissioned as an officer in the Australian Army. So Reg didn't even know about this ban, saying he wasn't supposed to enlist in the forces. He joins up, serves in the Middle East, Greece and Crete, and New Guinea, is later commissioned. And for people such as Reg and others, because they will operate alongside their non-Indigenous soldiers, their non-Indigenous mates, same pay, same conditions, same food, same equipment, same roles and responsibilities. We know, looking at some of their and reading their oral history testimonies, that for many this is their first instance or their first inkling of an equality with white Australia. So it was an interesting little benchmark as to what could be achieved. Often though, I'm not trying to look through with too rosy glasses, because you also know too that many individual servicemen and servicewomen still experienced forms of discrimination from their colleagues. So it wasn't but it's still an important part of the story. And then if you look at the irregular forces as well as auxiliaries, you have groups such as the Torres Strait Island Light Infantry Battalion. There was a massive number of Torres Strait Islanders who joined the army, and they had usually white officers and NCOs, so privates and corporals, but a huge motivation and commitment to defending their country and to defending their land. And in other areas too, particularly say in Northern Australia, the Northern Territory and Darwin, you have white units as well as American forces going into communities and being taught bush tucker, how to live off the land, surveillance. And so there's a big mobilisation of irregular or auxiliary Aboriginal servicemen and Aboriginal men and women who are supporting the war effort in a range of different ways. And sometimes too, they're just being called up and mobilised to work for the military, helping build roads, infrastructure, force facilities. So it's a real key moment, I think, in the sort of black and white relations. Although unfortunately, probably not enough was done in that space at that time.
So we've started to receive the first questions through the chat. So if you've got one to ask of Karl, please do type them in the chat window. My next question is about Prime Minister John Curtin, who described the Pacific War as the darkest hour in our history. Australian territories in New Guinea, Papua and the islands were attacked, and some regions were occupied by the Japanese, while there were nearly 100 Japanese attacks on mainland Australia. Can you talk to us a bit about how the Australian government and the people responded to this threat at the time?
Well, often we hear in the news about 2020 being a year of unprecedented this or that, but really if we go back to 1942, the darkest moment in our history, we have attacks on mainland Australia. Sydney Harbour comes under attack, Newcastle is shelled. How does the government and how do the people respond to this threat? And the answer is with sort of mass government control. So essentially, Prime Minister John Curtin enacted his catch call became all in. And so with Curtin's leadership of the government, the Australian government took over an unprecedented amount of control over goods, economy, basically everyone, whether it be the economy, whether it be through industry, whether it be through just labour, so how you could work, what you could do, where you could go. It was a huge element of control. And things such as prices and goods and profiteering or profits were regulated. Absenteeism in the workplace became illegal. You had an introduction of a form of industrial conscription. So things such as particularly male workers of working age from about 17 up to about 65. Everyone had to register what their skill set was. And so you had the Manpower Commission, and that determined what your skill set was and how you could best serve the Australia and support the military effort. And that was when you essentially received your call-up notice or you conscripted to work for the Civil Construction Corps, for example, and you could be sent to South Australia to develop and work on the Stuart Highway. You could be sent to Darwin to build some port facilities and fortifications. So you have this massive level of government and social control, which Australians had never really experienced before, and we haven't really experienced it since. And the other thing too is that income tax, for example, so it goes from being a state-based thing, administered by the states, through to being taken over by the federal government as an emergency wartime power. So the Australian federal government determines where people can go, what they're going to do. If you're sick or if you didn't like your job, you couldn't just quit. You had to go what you were told to do. You have your income tax is being sent off to the government and taking control. So it was a time of that real restrictions and I guess real limitations in response to this dire threat that the Australians at the time had felt and were experiencing.
So how about rationing in Australia? Because that was a big part of life on the home front as well. Can you talk to us about what rationing was like in Australia at that time?
Yeah, and so rationing really was just that everyday reminder that we were at war. So rationing was introduced not so much because we couldn't grow and feed ourselves, but because Australia was really providing the food, sending food to Britain to support the Empire, Britain and the Empire. And also we have something like 1 million American servicemen moved to Australia and into operations in New Guinea and the South Pacific. So essentially Australia is feeding an additional 1 million people on top of our own population of 7, we're feeding 8 million people. It's a huge effort, and some have actually argued that Australia's biggest contribution to the war was actually as the breadbasket for the Allies in the Pacific. So we can grow our own food, but rationing is introduced as a way to partly support our commitments to our allies, but also so you can introduce it and everyone has equal access to it. You had little ration books, little ration coupons, and from that to determine how much meat, butter and the like you could have. And in terms of what people lost, like we think it was a little bit harder earlier this year when you couldn't get toilet paper. With rationing, there was a reduction or limit of coal, fuel, textiles, milk, butter, beer. That would have sucked. All your basic day-to-day commodities was rationed and really restricted. So, and that was just this ever-present reminder of people going without. In addition to rationing too, there was constant government messages as to the government really promoted a very strict austerity campaign. So Australians were told to drink less alcohol, so drink less, smoke less tobacco, go without. Don't use your spare money or your spare change on things such as going and gambling, for example, or shopping at commodities. Invest in wool bonds, invest in victory loans. There was this real massive element of social control. So, for example, and again, in our day-to-day activity, things such as pink icing sugar disappeared for the duration of the war. You could not get things like pink icing sugar. Brides were encouraged to share their wedding dress amongst other brides. So we often see examples of one dress being worn by 4 or 5 separate brides. From a gentleman's point of view, the fashion went from a double-breasted suit to a single-breasted suit. Waistcoats went out, as did tails, so because textiles had to be really limited. And then in female fashion, sizes were reduced. So basically things came in 3 basic sizes, and swimsuits were banned. Well, they were banned, but swimsuits were stopped being produced during the duration of the war. And things were so dire that in 1942, in the lead up to Christmas, the government banned newspapers and department stores and the like using the word Santa Claus in their advertising, because the government was trying to curb frivolous spending. The flip side to that, though, is that advertisers and stores and the like, they got around it by saying, come inside and see your old friend. And everyone kind of went, we know you mean Santa, but we're not going to mention the press.
Yeah.
But again, it's just another reminder of how the war, it was very much a people's war for Australia.
So Prime Minister Curtin didn't live to see the end of the war. Can you talk to us now about how the end of the war came about, and those final, I guess the period between the BP Day celebrations and the official end of the war?
Yeah, and it's really one of the great ironies that Prime Minister John Curtin, who had put so much of his heart and soul and his body on the line to get us through this dire predicament during this terrible crisis. The Curtin died in mid-1945, so he did see the defeat of Italy and then later on Nazi Germany, but then passed away in July, just before the defeat of Japan. And the thing with Curtin is only like 60, so if you have a look at his photos, you think, oh, he's an old man, but really he's not. And FDR was the same, so President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Which is why when on the 15th of August people listen and they hear the voice of Ben Chifley. Chifley had been the Treasurer, and then later on he became the Prime Minister. And you have that announcement. But it's really, in many ways, it's not really the end of the story. Like, you'd like to think from a convenient point of view that war ends, everybody's coming home, but really it's just the start of the next chapter. So there's a bit of a lull. So the hostilities cease on the 15th of August. But it's not until the 2nd of September 1945 that you see the very big Japanese surrender ceremony that takes place on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbour. The day itself is filled with pageantry. You have General Sir Thomas Blamey signs a document on behalf of Australia. There's a large number of, well, we know of at least several other Australian delegates and a new war correspondent and one Australian rating who sort of snuck on board the USS Missouri. So we do have some Australian witnesses at that historic moment. Likewise, there are Australian ships in the Tokyo Bay. And very quickly on, so there's an Australian presence at the signing of the surrender document on the 2nd of September. And then thereafter, what we do see too is a whole range of different surrender ceremonies that take place right across our region. So there's quite a large one at Cape Wom in New Guinea, for example, in Rabaul, in Simpson Harbour at Rabaul, Morris High and elsewhere. So the story now starts to change. There's a very big pressure too on repatriating our prisoners of war. And from September onwards, you start to see large numbers of prisoners of the Japanese returning home, and this is really when those families who had loved ones whose loved ones were taken prisoner in early 1942, it's only in September of 1945 that they start to get a sense of what had happened to them, what are their fates, did they survive, did they die during the conflict. So that's 3.5 years, that's a massive gap of not knowing. And then you've got the very slow repatriation of Australian forces from across Southeast Asia and really across the Pacific, because there's still, on the 15th of August, there's something like 300,000 Australian personnel deployed right across the world. And in addition to us wanting to get our own men and women back home, there's international shipping shortages. So everyone wants to get their forces back. They want to send the enemy away. You have things such as the war crimes investigations. And very quickly too, we're starting to organise our forces for what will become the British Commonwealth occupation of Japan. So while you'd like to think of the surrender, BP Day and then the surrender ceremony as bookending it and closing the book, there's really all these other chapters or appendices that the story continues.
And given all that Australia and soldiers and Australians more broadly had been through at that time, I guess it's no surprise that VPD celebrations were what they were and that they're so fondly remembered today. But can you talk to us, I guess, before we close and head to questions from people online, can you talk to us a bit about how Australia emerged from the Second World War? What was life like post-war, and did it change our relationship with other nations?
I think I really do believe, and have argued in many places, that the Second World War was really the shaping and defining conflict of Australia in the 20th century. So in addition to suffering what we achieved in the military on the battlefield, in addition to that sense of loss, Australia does emerge from the conflict confident, I think self-assured. It has a say and a place on the world stage. So from a military and a sense of identity is quite significant. The big change that occurred in Australian industry, for example, keep in mind that before the Second World War, Australia hadn't even mass-produced a car. Yet during the conflict, our industry tools up and mobilises for the war, and we build something like 3,000 different aircraft. We have tanks, landing craft, universal carriers, munitions. So there's a big boom in industry. So that skill set goes from a wartime need and then transitioned very easily into a post-war economic boom. You have a changing relationship with Britain and the United States. And for the first time too, we've got thousands of Australian men and women engaging and travelling to Oceania as well as Asia. And so they're bringing back different ideas about the peoples of the region, different languages, different religions. So it is a huge watershed. In addition to, for example, the changing role of women, it's just a key moment in our history in shaping where we went to after the Second War in that post-war world. And keep in mind too that with post-war migration, that forever changes our look, our language, our cuisine. So in many ways, it's the Second World War in Australia was a people's conflict and was really a watershed in Australian history.
Thank you, Karl. So we'll turn now to some questions from people online watching. So if you've got a question, please do send it through. The first one is from Graham, who asks for your thoughts on Australian forces being left with mopping up duties in the Southwest Pacific area in 1945.
That's a great question. I wonder if it's a little bit loaded. Mainly because I spent such a long time looking at the final campaign. So in 1944 and 1945, the Australian forces took over, particularly in New Guinea and Bougainville and Rabaul. We relieved the American garrison, the American troops. The Americans then go on and fight in the Philippines, fight to liberate the Philippines. And there's this idea or a notion, and not without legitimacy, that we were stuck with these mopping up campaigns. Why is it that after 3.5 years Australian troops are still fighting in New Guinea? It's a really interesting idea, and it helps this notion of why Australia's marginalised, and then even with the First Australia Corps with their operations going to Borneo in mid-1945, or why are they going to Borneo to liberate parts of the Netherlands East Indies? But so the real argument is that why we've just committed so much to this force and for the war effort, particularly during those key 1942 battles. By 1945, we kind of marginalised in these sideshows or mopping up campaigns, and despite what they do in New Guinea, Bougainville and also Borneo, that those campaigns won't help defeat Japan. So it's a really strong argument, and certainly many leaders, many military officers, and also many veterans themselves, with hindsight, felt that that was the case, that they'd been pushed aside. However, I would argue a little bit differently, because, say, in New Guinea and Bougainville, and this followed the view of the Australian government at the time, it was these were Australian territories, and it was really important from the Australian government point of view that we wanted to be shown that we had large numbers of Australian forces in these areas, liberating parts of Australian territory, and we didn't want the idea that we just let all the Americans do the heavy lifting. We wanted to pursue the war and liberate Australian territory and have that responsibility of the people of New Guinea and Solomon Islands, for example. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that it was MacArthur MacArthur directed that we would take over those areas. MacArthur set up the size of the forces to be deployed. So what's the question? Do you have a large garrison force who could be there for 1 or 2 more years? Remember, everyone thought the war continues in 1946, or do you conduct sort of short, sharp campaigns when it was thought that the Australians would outnumber the Japanese? Now, in hindsight, we know that wasn't the case, particularly places at Bougainville. The Japanese were much stronger than the Australian intelligence had suggested. But I have argued that I think Bougainville's justified, as was New Guinea. Tarakan, once you move into the bordering campaigns, it's a little bit different. They are much more political. There's this very strong argument that Douglas MacArthur wanted to see himself as the liberator of parts of the Netherlands East Indies, so he wanted to liberate parts of the Netherlands East Indies. The First Australia Corps was really looking for a job because they weren't going to be employed in the Philippines, so he had to give the noisy Australians something to do, which is partly why he went and conducted these OVA operations in Borneo. The only operation I feel is probably unnecessary was Balikpapan, which occurred on the 1st of July 1945. Balikpapan was really the high point of Australia's military effort. We conduct a massive amphibious operation. The entire 7th Division hits the beach, but it does take place with 6 weeks before the end of the war. And even a lot of the senior commanders, while the men were incredibly skilled and were successful, I think Balikpapan really had no real point to it. There was no strategic outcome. But certainly too, that's probably why the notion of Australia's war is a little bit clouded in the Second World War. So unlike in the First World War, where the Australia Corps can seem to be leading and spearheading the British advance to defeat Germany. Well, that's the myth anyway. By 1945, we've got this massive force, but we're really quite widely dispersed. In some ways, the story has been about the controversy, about mopping up, rather than what the guys actually did or why they did it.
So the next question is from Patricia, and you touched on this a little bit during our discussion earlier, but she's asked about prisoners of war and also shared some of her personal family story. So Patricia says that there is so much emphasis on the celebrations in Martin Place, but no mention of the thousands of prisoners still held by Japanese who did not believe the surrender, and shared that her mother and father were held for at least another 4 weeks. So can you talk about that gap in a bit more detail between the celebrations at home, but the reality still for some prisoners of war held overseas?
Well, really, thank you, Patricia, for sharing that example and talking about your parents, because it highlights again that there's so many different stories and so many different experiences, and in many ways there is no one single narrative. So the soldiers, for example, the prisoners were kept in Changi. So you've got Australian POWs, both military as well as civilians, because there's something like 1,500 Australian civilians who are also interned by the Japanese, and many of those are in places such as, there's a large number in the Philippines, for example, as well as in Hong Kong, Singapore and Indochina. So in those parts that are still very much part of the Japanese Empire, it takes several days before the news filters to the prisoners that the war is over. We know from accounts from soldiers in Changi, for example, they can recognise that there's a lot of aircraft flying above. Initially, their Japanese guards tell them the Japanese airplanes, but the Australians can pick out the RAF Randalls or the American Star and Bar on the US Army Air Force aircraft. So the Australian POWs realise or recognise that they're Allied aircraft. And then you have things such as pamphlets, I should say. Also, too, a lot of Australian prisoners of war note afterwards that the attitude and demeanour of the Japanese and Korean guards towards them suddenly changed. So from being very brutal and hostile and aggressive to, hey, we're all friends, it's all kind of good. There was this little there's a shift marked in attitude and approach and just demeanour, which was again another clue before that official notification the prisoners were to be relieved, or that the war was over, that the Allies had won, and then they go about to go home. So it takes a little while for that news to filter in, and even then you've got sort of this agonising gap of, okay, the war's over, but when can I come home? In some places such as Singapore, they go through the Philippines before they come back to Australia. And it often really takes a while because Australian prisoners of war are really everywhere.
So Michael has asked a question that's on a related topic, which was, can you please expand on how Japanese soldiers were repatriated to Japan, given the shortage of shipping at the time?
So from the Australian point of view, within, say, New Guinea, within the Australian territory, I should say, so New Guinea, Bougainville, and elsewhere in the islands, the Australian forces put a real emphasis on consolidating the Japanese into certain areas. So you have on Bougainville, for example, the Japanese who were deployed across the entire island, as well as in parts of New Guinea. They were centralised into key pickup points. The Australian forces then go in to feed and provide food, medical assistance and care to the Japanese. And also places like Rabaul, so the Japanese forces are centralised. And then there's a very big effort working in parallel. One is to process all Japanese soldiers, so name, rank, serial number and the like, because that's often tied to investigations about war crimes. But for many and for most Japanese ranking soldiers or sailors, they're processed, put together in an area, and during the second half of 1945, very quickly repatriated back to Japan. So things such as the British Pacific Fleet and aircraft carriers were employed to just get as many bodies onto those ships and sent them back to Japan very quickly. Because the Australian government didn't want the Japanese forces or Japanese troops to remain in Australian territory. There was some concern that the Japanese could potentially foster, because part of that is the Australians are going to go back and they're going to reassert colonial control and administration over their territories. And so having lost control for 3.5 years, and you see this in the notes in the National Archives, for example, the Australian government doesn't want local resistance movements popping up to conduct anti-colonist or anti-colonial campaigns. So the emphasis on the Australian government and Australian forces is to get the Japanese out of New Guinea and out of Bougainville as quickly as possible. They don't want the Japanese to become a distraction or worse. But that also causes a little bit of resentment, particularly from the Australian forces who are, on Bougainville, for example, there's more than 30,000 Australian soldiers. So they see the Japanese troops being repatriated back to Japan very quickly, but the soldiers are like, well, what about me? I'm still stuck here in Torokina or Ibuka. When am I going to get back home? And we also see this too in places such as Rabaul, where you still have numbers of Australian forces well into 1946. So the Australian military and the Allied military too quickly want to get rid of, remove and repatriate the Japanese forces, bring back our own PWs. But for many servicemen and servicewomen, they are stuck it certainly felt as though they're stuck in the islands for months on end, really not until 1946 in some areas.
So you referenced earlier our current COVID pandemic situation, and we've got a question from Brendan that he's been thinking in this current COVID budget stress time about the levels of debt that were held by federal and state governments during that Second World War period in Australia. So can you talk to us at all about that? What were our financial commitments at the time, and how did that impact on daily life? You spoke about rationing and shortages. So can you talk to us a bit about the levels of debt at that time?
Generally, but not exactly specifically. So Misha de Vogel, for example, she's an excellent historian. She's now at the Army History Unit. She's doing her PhD at UNSW Canberra. She's looking more at the financing of the war. But it's interesting because Australia does emerge from the conflict without a massive debt. So, and the biggest part of this was through our work of Lend-Lease with the Americans. So that was, unlike say with the British, where we had a different trade and negotiating arrangements and we were part of the British Sterling group, with the Americans, particularly in the Pacific War, so when our P-40 Kitty Hawk and our tanks that we got from the Americans, they didn't just give it to us for free. It's the case of, well, you can lease it. We will lease it to you. So here's a tank, but it's going to cost you X number of US dollars or US pounds. But so there was a big increase in government spending, so both from military hardware. There's also a massive government investment in infrastructure. So because of the ports, aircrafts, airfields and the like. So government spending is massive. Part of how we're able to emerge from the Second World War without a huge debt, though, is because of Lend-Lease and because we're feeding the troops. So yes, the Americans will bill us for a Sherman tank or a Grant tank or a P-40 Kitty Hawk, but then we'll bill the Americans for the food, the mutton and the like that we're sending back and supporting the forces. So it's a bit of a delicate dance as to who owes who what. But by the early sort of 46, 47, 48, so chiefly still Prime Minister, so only a couple of years after the war, Australia has repaid its foreign debt, particularly to Lend-Lease, particularly to the Americans. And so we do emerge from the war not bankrupt in the same way that, say, Britain is, for example, who has a massive debt to India as well as the United States. So there was an element of financial, they balanced the books pretty well, given the dire circumstances. And things such as the control of income tax, for example, was a key source for the government. And also, too, people really, it wasn't as though they just told to do this. People really felt the need to do it. So you do have things such as the victory loans, the multiple loans, victory loans, the liberty loans, where people invested their money to buy war bonds, and that was additional cash which the government could use for the war effort. That's why we have G for George. G for George came out here in 1944 as part of that war bonds type of drive. It's like, if you give us your £2 and your £2 and your £2 and your £2, then we can buy a Lancaster, and from that we can do this and defeat the enemy. So that's the way they did it.
Some early crowdsourcing there.
Pretty much, and this is across, so you could, they did this in Britain, they did this across the Empire, and so almost, Wollongong or Canberra, we can pay for our own Spitfire type of thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Karl. So that's it for today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. If you haven't already, please search for the Australian War Memorial on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube. And you can find out more about our museum at home content. A copy of this webinar will be available online soon. Thanks again, and we'll see you for our next webinar.